There's an abandoned military base at the edge of Long Island. A rusted radar tower still turns, though there's no signal left to catch. Locals say it's just an empty shell, but others say it was once the center of something far stranger. Time travel, mind control, lost children and erased memories. Tonight we go deeper. This is the story of the Montauk Project, a tale that lives somewhere between classified files and forgotten dreams. Let yourself drift. Let the questions unfold. The truth is not what matters. The resonance is. Chapter 1: The Foundations of Secrecy. Montauk, a small and windswept point at the far end of Long Island, has always had a sense of being on the edge, geographically, culturally, even psychologically. Surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean on three sides, the land feels distant from the rest of New York, as though suspended between land and sea, reality and imagination. In the early 20th century, it was a quiet fishing village, known for its salty air and sleepy piers. But as the 1940s approached and the world spiraled into war, Montauk changed. The U.S. military selected this remote tip as the location for a new defense installation, Camp Hero. On the surface, it was simply another coastal defense site, a few bunkers, a radar tower, fences, soldiers. But under the surface, quite literally, the stories would begin to twist. Camp Hero, according to official records, was designed to guard the New York coastline from possible Axis naval activity. Massive concrete bunkers were camouflaged as seaside cottages to deceive German U-boats lurking offshore. Yet even as the war ended and other coastal stations were decommissioned, Camp Hero remained active. For years. Then the secrecy began. The radar installation, massive and looming, was the centerpiece. A Sage semi-automatic ground environment radar capable of tracking airborne threats across hundreds of miles. It emitted a frequency so powerful that locals reported headaches, strange dreams, interrupted radio signals. Some claimed their pets would whimper and hide when the radar dish turned in their direction. Yet most residents accepted these oddities as the background hum of military life. After all, this was the Cold War. Secrets were normal. Silence was safety. But in the shadows of this coastal outpost, something else, something stranger, may have been unfolding. For years, Camp Hero faded from attention. Officially decommissioned in the late 1960s, the base was abandoned, or so it seemed. The radar tower remained, rusting but intact. Locals noted that the property was still curiously guarded. Fences were maintained. Signs warned against trespassing. Rumors circulated that underground tunnels still had power, that trucks occasionally arrived late at night. Then came the first wave of whispers. In the early 1980s, a man named Preston Nichols came forward. An electrical engineer by trade, Nichols claimed he had recovered memories of having worked on classified experiments beneath Camp Hero. But these weren't simple military trials. What he described sounded more like science fiction. Time travel, mind control, teleportation, contact with non-human intelligences. Most dismissed him, but others listened. Nichols wrote a book titled The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time. Co-authored with Peter Moon, it claimed that after the cancellation of the controversial Philadelphia experiment in 1943, an alleged Navy attempt to render a ship invisible, the research continued quietly in Montauk. The Philadelphia experiment was already shrouded in mystery and doubt. The USS Eldridge, the ship supposedly involved, became the centerpiece of a conspiracy involving teleportation, temporal displacement, and crew members fused into bulkheads. It was a story dismissed by the Navy, but it refused to die. According to Nichols, the Eldridge experiment did not end the research, it simply relocated it to Montauk, the infrastructure of control. What made Nichols' claims resonate with some listeners was their specificity. He described the architecture of the underground base. Hallways lined with metal panels, rooms designed for electromagnetic experiments, chairs allegedly used to amplify psychic abilities, and even a device called the Montauk chair, supposedly developed from alien technology capable of reading and projecting human thought. According to Nichols, the experiments were based on the work of Nikola Tesla, Wilhelm Reich, and even Aleister Crowley, blending science, metaphysics, and occultism into something entirely new and unsettling. He said he worked alongside men with no memory of how they got there, scientists with falsified identities, and even children, hundreds of them, brought in for experiments on psychological endurance, remote viewing, and telekinetic response. Some, Nichols claimed, never left. But who would believe it? Even within fringe communities, the Montauk claims were considered extreme. The story included recovered memories, implanted false timelines, and mass erasure of public records. Nichols claimed that after every shift, workers would have their memories blanked, not through hypnosis, but via complex electromagnetic fields. He described being pulled into multiple versions of reality, where events did not unfold the same way twice. His colleagues began to suffer breakdowns or disappear altogether. But what made his account different from typical science fiction was not just what he said, but where he said it happened. Montauk was real. Camp Hero was real. The radar tower was real. And anyone could go there. Visitors to the site in the 1980s and 1990s described a place that felt wrong. Not dangerous, but uneasy. Some said they heard humming under their feet. Others claimed their watches stopped working near the radar. Several described dreams that became clearer the closer they approached the base. Of course, none of this proved anything. But it didn't have to, for the story was already spreading. What made the Montauk story feel disturbingly plausible to some wasn't just the detail. It was how closely it echoed real, verified government experiments from the same era. In the mid-1970s, documents were declassified that revealed the existence of Project MKUltra, a covert CIA program aimed at developing methods of mind control, interrogation resistance, and behavior modification. These projects included the use of LSD, sensory deprivation, electromagnetic fields, and even hypnosis, all performed on unwitting subjects. Much of what was said about the Montauk chair, the attempt to influence or even override thought, felt like a natural extension of MKUltra, only hidden deeper and pushed further. Nichols and his co-author drew direct lines between the programs. They suggested that after MKUltra was publicly exposed, the more extreme aspects of psychological experimentation had been shifted into black-budget projects, far from oversight, far from the press, and Montauk was one of the destinations. There were also claims of connections to Project Stargate, a RAAL initiative launched by the U.S. government to explore remote viewing, the supposed psychic ability to see events at a distance. Funded and operated under the Defense Intelligence Agency, Stargate involved real military personnel and operated into the 1990s. Suddenly, the Montauk stories, as wild as they seemed, weren't entirely without historical context. And that made people uneasy. The missing boys. Perhaps the darkest part of the Montauk narrative is what Nichols and others alleged about the involvement of children. The claims were vague but consistent, that boys aged 10 to 16 were brought into the facility, some homeless, some abducted, others perhaps born into government-run programs, and subjected to extreme psychological testing. They were, according to the story, trained to withstand isolation, pain, and psychic strain. They were also said to be placed in the Montauk chair to test their telepathic potential, and to record how their thoughts could influence magnetic fields or even open temporary rips in space. Nichols stated that many of these children were never seen again. Some, he said, aged rapidly and died. Others were allegedly sent through time, left in other decades or alternate realities, unreachable and untraceable. There is no physical proof of any of this. No names, no missing persons reports directly tied. Only stories. But the very absence of records, said believers, was the point. A perfect erasure conducted by those who had perfected secrecy itself. A silence too loud. Over the years, journalists, researchers, and skeptics have visited Camp Hero. They found graffiti, crumbling tunnels, heavy metal doors welded shut. No official records confirm underground chambers beneath the radar tower. No evidence of advanced equipment or experiments. But strange patterns remain. Compass needles spin in certain areas. Animals avoid others entirely. Tourists report pressure headaches near the tower. Cell service drops out inexplicably for minutes at a time. These details prove nothing. But in the logic of conspiracy, absence of evidence becomes its own kind of signal. And for many, Camp Hero remains a place that feels off. Not in any measurable way, but in the bones, in the gut, in the kind of fear that whispers rather than shouts. In 2016, when Netflix released the first season of Stranger Things, sharp-eyed viewers noticed something curious in early development materials. The show was originally titled Montauk. The Duffer Brothers, creators of the series, openly cited the Montauk Project as a foundational inspiration for their story. A secret government program involving a child with psychic powers, a mysterious facility, and a tear in reality that lets something monstrous through. Sound familiar? The parallels were deliberate. Although the series eventually moved its setting to fictional Hawkins, Indiana, the DNA of the Montauk legend was unmistakable. 11. The gifted girl in the lab. The experiments in psychic warfare. The gate to another dimension. The creature that should not exist. Even the theme of memory suppression and hidden trauma. Stranger Things didn't invent the Montauk Project, but it gave it new life and a wider audience than Nichols ever could have imagined. The myth that lingers. Today, Camp Hero is a state park. Families picnic on the grass. Tourists pose for photos in front of the radar tower. The grounds are open, but certain buildings remain sealed, untouched, guarded not by men, but by history and suspicion. Signs warn, danger, unsafe structure, do not enter. But for those who believe, it's not the structure that's unsafe. It's what might still lie beneath it. Urban explorers have mapped parts of the base, but some corridors go deeper than expected, ending at thick steel doors or staircases that descend into darkness and floodwater. No one seems to know how far the tunnels go, or if they truly ever stop. Some say the experiments continue. Others say they never happened, and most simply stop asking. But whether myth or memory, the Montauk Project refuses to disappear. It exists in a space between skepticism and faith, between entertainment and belief, the kind of story that doesn't die, because its power was never in proving anything. Its power is in what it allows us to imagine. When Preston Nichols first spoke of time travel in relation to Camp Hero, even his most curious listeners paused. Telepathy? Maybe. Government experiments? Plausible. But time portals? It sounded like fiction, like something from a pulp novel or a midnight radio broadcast. And yet, the concept would become one of the most defining elements of the Montauk mythos. The chair and the gate. According to Nichols, the Montauk chair was not just a psychic amplifier. As Duncan Cameron's abilities increased, the chair began doing more than projecting images. It began to interact with space itself. Nichols claimed that under specific frequencies, and when Duncan entered a deep trance, the chair would open something resembling a tunnel through time. It would begin with flashes, historical images, cities from different eras, figures from ancient and distant futures. Then, allegedly, the air would vibrate and a rift would form, a tear in the very fabric of the present. Personnel referred to these anomalies as portals. Some said they could peer into them and see different times. Others claimed that small objects were sent through coins, equipment, even animals. But eventually, Nichols said they went further. They sent people. The story goes that volunteers or test subjects walked into the portal and disappeared. Sometimes they returned with fragmented memories. Sometimes they returned aged or changed. And sometimes they didn't return at all. Where did they go? Nichols never offered firm answers. Only speculation. Destination: 1943. Perhaps the most infamous time travel claim in the Montauk legend is the alleged link to the Philadelphia experiment. The theory goes that in 1943, the Navy attempted to make the USS Eldridge invisible to radar. But instead of achieving simple cloaking, the ship vanished entirely, reappearing minutes later with its crew disoriented, injured, or embedded in the metal of the ship itself. While historians and the Navy deny this ever occurred, Montauk believers argue otherwise. They claim that the Montauk portal was eventually tuned to the exact date of the Philadelphia test, August 12, 1943. Duncan, in the chair, was said to have made contact with that moment in time. According to the story, the scientists at Montauk were told they had accidentally created a loop linking 1983 to 1943, two poles of the same temporal experiment, and someone or something had to break it. Nichols claimed that to close the loop, Duncan had to be removed from the system. Once he was disconnected, the portal collapsed and the timeline stabilized, or as some say, merely paused. Tangled timelines. Duncan Cameron's backstory is where the Montauk narrative becomes even more surreal. In Nichols' account, Duncan was not just a psychic. He was a reincarnated version of someone who had served on the Eldridge. Some versions of the story say Duncan was born in the 1950s. Others suggest he was pulled from the past, reborn in a modern body, or even cloned using advanced DNA technology. None of this is verifiable, but it illustrates a key theme that runs through the Montauk mythos: fractured identity. Time travel in this story is not just about moving through years. It's about how memory, self, and reality can unravel when time becomes elastic. Several participants, Nichols included, claimed they had conflicting memories, as if they'd lived multiple versions of their own life. Timelines didn't just cross, they bled. Though Montauk is the most well-known alleged time experiment site, it is not the only one. As the mythos expanded, new threads were woven into its framework, one of the most prominent being Project Pegasus. In the early 2000s, a man named Andrew Bayago came forward claiming he had been part of a secret U.S. government program in the 1970s dedicated to time travel. The project, he said, operated under DARPA and involved teleportation, chronovisors, devices that displayed past or future events, and trips to both past centuries and even Mars. To most, Bayago's claims sounded absurd. But to believers in Montauk, they sounded eerily familiar. The two narratives shared similar elements. Child participants trained for extreme cognitive strain. Electromagnetic field manipulation as the method of travel. Missing time and altered memory. And perhaps most notably, a belief that multiple timelines existed and that the U.S. government had access to them. Some theorists proposed that Project Pegasus and Montauk were parallel programs, or perhaps phases of the same long-running effort to map, alter, or even weaponize time. If true, the implications were staggering. Temporal surveillance and control. Within these theories lies a disturbing suggestion that the ultimate purpose of the Montauk experiments was not just exploration, but control. Control of future events by observing or influencing key historical turning points. Control of public perception by rewriting or suppressing timelines. Control of individual identity through memory alteration or reprogramming. Some Montauk researchers speak of temporal feedback loops, situations where actions in the present send ripples into the past, which then alter the present itself. These loops, they claim, are not accidents, but deliberate attempts to reshape history without detection. If an undesired political leader emerged in one version of reality, for example, could that timeline be redirected? Could a psychic operative be inserted into a critical moment to influence events, not with weapons but with thought? There is, of course, no evidence of this, but the idea itself has a kind of seductive paranoia, a narrative that explains inconsistency, chaos, and coincidence by turning them into intentional design. Time and trauma. Another recurring motif in the Montauk story is psychological fragmentation. Participants frequently describe feelings of dissociation, conflicting memory, and dreams that feel more like recovered experiences than fantasy. Nichols claimed that even outside the project, time anomalies followed him, moments that would jump, days that seemed to repeat, and long stretches of lost memory. For believers, time travel wasn't just disorienting, it was wounding. Some described what felt like temporal scars, deep, psychic disturbances tied to events they couldn't quite place in chronological memory. Others believed they had met different versions of themselves, younger, older, or altered in personality, during transit through Montauk's alleged portals. Still, others feared they had never returned fully. They were, in a sense, still lost in time, even if their bodies remained in the present. As the Montauk narrative grew more complex, it began to resemble not just a conspiracy theory, but a kind of modern mythology, a belief system not grounded in evidence but in meaning. Time travel in the Montauk mythos is not just a plot device. It becomes a metaphor for lost childhood, unresolved trauma, erased history, the fear that reality is unstable and always subject to outside manipulation. And in that sense, it speaks to something very real. By the late 1990s, online forums were flooded with Montauk-related discussions. People claimed spontaneous memories, dreams of strange underground labs, or déjà vu that could not be explained. Some said they had found references to events that no longer existed, books that disappeared, people who no longer remembered shared experiences. Theories of a Mandela effect, a cultural phenomenon in which large groups of people misremember key historical facts, became tied to Montauk's legacy. Was the collective memory being rewritten? Were some of us remembering fragments from alternate timelines? Montauk believers said yes. From the underground to the internet. In the early 2000s, Montauk became a regular feature in podcasts, fringe documentaries, YouTube rabbit holes, and digital comics. Writers, screenwriters, and game developers began referencing the project directly or indirectly. It became a kind of open-source myth, one anyone could borrow from, reinterpret, or expand. Some treated it as satire. Others took it seriously. Most stood somewhere in between. What made Montauk different from other conspiracy theories was that it did not offer a single answer. There was no clear goal, no master villain, no political motive. Instead, it posed a question. What if reality is not what we think it is? And what if someone already figured that out and didn't tell us? That question doesn't need proof to resonate. It only needs doubt, the faith of the fringe. Skeptics often argue that belief in projects like Montauk is a failure of reason. But to others, it's something deeper, a response to the incompleteness of official history. When stories don't add up, when memory feels fragile, when authority fails to explain the surreal moments of life, people look for other frameworks, and Montauk offers one. Says, you were right to feel like something's off. Says, time can be tampered with. Says, you are not crazy. You are waking up. For some, that message is empowering. For others, it's terrifying. But it is never boring. Chapter 3, Psychic Frontiers and the Mind as a Weapon. In the aftermath of World War II, world powers turned their attention from physical battlefields to more subtle territories. Influence, perception, and most intriguingly, the human mind itself. The Cold War wasn't just a conflict of ideologies or weapons. It was a race to discover how far the mind could be manipulated, sharpened, or even used as a tool of war. Montauk, according to its most persistent legends, was a critical site in this new frontier. Echoes of MKUltra. Any exploration of psychic experimentation inevitably returns to MKUltra, a real and thoroughly documented CIA program active between the 1950s and 1970s. Its existence is not speculative. In 1975, the Church Committee investigations revealed that the U.S. government had conducted extensive mind control research using psychoactive drugs, LSD, mescaline, hypnosis, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, electroshock therapy. Some tests were voluntary, many were not. Victims included military personnel, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and ordinary citizens. In some cases, memory erasure was attempted, not just to suppress trauma, but as part of an actual operational tactic to control, reprogram, and potentially reinsert individuals into society. For believers in the Montauk Project, MKUltra was not an isolated mistake. It was a starting point. They argue that when MKUltra's existence became public, its most dangerous work was simply moved underground, both metaphorically and literally, into places like Camp Hero, the Montauk Chair Revisited. In Chapter 1, we touched on the Montauk Chair, the mysterious psychic interface at the heart of the alleged experiments. But the details deepen and darken when viewed through the lens of intentional psychic weaponization. According to Nichols, the chair evolved over time. What began as a passive receiver of thoughts became an active projector. Duncan Cameron, the supposed psychic prodigy, was not merely visualizing, he was influencing people. In early stages, it was simple, inducing sleep at a distance, causing mild confusion or nausea, altering mood in nearby rooms. Later, Nichols claimed, the influence extended into the behavioral field, short-term memory lapses, decision-making disruptions, and even the ability to plant images or ideas in the minds of others without them realizing it. They called it thought seeding. If true, the implications are chilling. Thought becomes weapon. Ideas become invasive. Identity becomes porous. And the human mind, once sacred, becomes a battlefield. Psychotronics and global research. Montauk wasn't the only alleged hub of such research. In the Soviet Union, the term psychotronics referred to the study of mind-influencing energy systems. Declassified documents confirm that the USSR funded entire research facilities focused on remote viewing, bioenergetics, microwave weapons, brainwave synchronization. Some of these programs were purely theoretical. Others reportedly yielded results that remain unpublished. In the U.S., experiments continued under other names: Project Stargate, Remote Viewing, Project Grill Flame, Project Center Lane. All involved military psychics attempting to access enemy locations, read minds, or detect nuclear sites from a distance. While mainstream science rejects these efforts as failed or pseudoscientific, many of the reports were classified for decades. Some remain so. To Montauk believers, these weren't failures. They were stepping stones, components of a larger puzzle, quietly assembled in secret. And at the center of that puzzle sat a chair, a tower, and a forgotten base on Long Island. Mental intrusion and psychic viruses. Among the most controversial claims surrounding the Montauk Project is the idea that thoughts, under certain circumstances, can behave like code. Just as a virus infects a machine, some theorists argue that ideas, when delivered with enough psychic force, can infect a human mind. Not by persuasion or logic, but through direct transmission, bypassing reason, emotion, even awareness. Nichols and other Montauk sources suggested that during advanced stages of experimentation, Duncan Cameron was used to test these possibilities. The method involved projecting fully formed mental constructs, images, commands, even dreams, into the minds of unsuspecting test subjects. Some recipients reportedly believed the thoughts were their own, changed their behavior without realizing it, developed artificial memories or compulsions. These were not hallucinations. In Montauk lore, they were injected thoughts. One particular claim, difficult to substantiate but often repeated, is that test subjects would dream the same exact scenario within hours of each other, down to identical dialogue, locations, and sequences. The theory became known as psychic broadcasting. In the most extreme variations, Nichols claimed that entire emotional states, fear, obedience, ecstasy, could be induced in groups of people from a distance using the chair as a broadcast node. It sounds impossible, and yet it mirrors real-world research in emotional contagion, group hypnosis, and the effects of electromagnetic fields on mood and cognition. The boundary between science and story begins to blur. Training the gifted. If such psychic techniques existed, how would they be sustained? The answer in the Montauk narrative is training. Specifically, the targeted selection of children believed to possess latent extrasensory abilities. These were not ordinary school programs. According to Nichols, a covert system was used to locate children with specific brainwave patterns, often detected through standardized testing, IQ programs, or behavioral anomalies flagged in school systems. Once selected, these children were allegedly removed from their families, sometimes with consent, sometimes without, and brought to facilities like Camp Hero. There, they were subjected to rigorous psychological endurance tests, designed to push the brain past normal processing thresholds. The process was described as brutal, emotionally damaging, and in many cases permanent. They were taught to hold multiple images in mind simultaneously, focus through pain or panic, create and collapse mental structures, imaginary rooms, symbols, doors, enter altered states on command. Some did not survive. Others lost all memory of the training, and a few, Nichols claimed, became something else entirely, capable of performing psychic tasks without equipment, without focus, even without knowing what they were doing. The programs called them natural channels. Can the mind be turned off? In the deepest recesses of Montauk mythology is a question few dare to ask directly. Can a human mind be shut down remotely like a machine? Nichols suggested that in late-stage experiments, researchers attempted neurological disruptions using targeted frequency patterns. The idea was to induce temporary memory loss, mental whiteout, full conscious suspension, obedient suggestibility. The theoretical method, a precise combination of ELF waves, extremely low frequency, pulse-modulated signals, induced sleep state entrainment. The result, allegedly, was an individual who remained awake, but mentally empty, open to instruction, suggestion, or manipulation. No independent verification of this has ever been found. Yet the idea resonates with popular fears about subliminal messaging, behavioral programming, and technological hypnosis. It taps into something ancient, the terror of losing control over your own thoughts, and that, perhaps more than any other element, is what gives Montauk its chilling power. Not the monsters, not the time portals, but the notion that your mind may not be fully your own. The myth of psychic warfare. Whether real or fabricated, the Montauk story reflects a long-standing fear that stretches across cultures and centuries, that thought itself can be used as a weapon. From Tibetan legends of tulpa, beings created through mental focus, to medieval beliefs in curses and hexes, to Cold War fears of Soviet mind control, the weaponization of the unseen has always haunted the human imagination. Montauk simply modernized that fear. Instead of mystics, it gave us engineers. Instead of rituals, it offered machines. Instead of demons, it described frequencies. But the outcome was the same, a world where the boundaries between mind and reality no longer held firm. In this version of the world, a single, well-trained psychic could implant ideas into the minds of enemies, disrupt communication lines with thought alone, create confusion on battlefields from miles away, or, most terrifyingly, turn peaceful civilians into unknowing operatives. The enemy wasn't out there. The enemy was inside your head. Why these stories persist? Skeptics ask, why do people believe this? Why does Montauk refuse to fade? The answer may lie not in evidence, but in the nature of uncertainty itself. We live in an age of surveillance, digital manipulation, behavioral targeting, and neural interface research. The very technologies we build echo the ideas embedded in the Montauk myth, reading brainwaves, influencing mood through algorithms, training AI to detect and manipulate emotional states. Montauk, in a sense, was ahead of its time, not necessarily in accuracy, but in metaphor. It provided a story that explains the feeling that something invisible is shaping our thoughts. Whether it's media, politics, data, or something stranger. And unlike many conspiracy theories, Montauk never asks you to overthrow belief in science. Simply asks, what if someone already went further with it than we ever imagined? That question lingers, and for some, it is easier to believe in a psychic war than to believe no one is in control at all. Chapter 4: Children of the Experiment. In the shadows of every Montauk story lies a chilling constant. The children, whispers of missing boys, of stolen memories, of experiments conducted on young minds echo through the accounts of Preston Nichols and others. These children weren't simply present, they were, in many versions of the story, the true focus. Montauk wasn't just a site of research. It was, they claim, a training ground, a factory for shaping something new, or erasing something old, the recruits who never returned. Nichols claimed that hundreds, possibly thousands, of children passed through the underground levels of Camp Hero during the height of the Montauk Project. Many were never documented. Some were said to be taken from foster homes, orphanages, or off the streets of major cities. Some were allegedly chosen based on IQ tests, behavioral anomalies, or even psychic sensitivity scores hidden within school records. Others simply vanished. What they were subjected to depends on which version of the story you hear. Some accounts speak of psychic conditioning, long periods in isolation chambers, visual tests with strange symbols, memory loop induction. Others suggest mechanical implants, small devices placed behind the ear or at the base of the skull, designed to monitor or control. Still others mention exposure to experimental energy fields, designed to enhance brainwave activity or induce altered states. A few supposed survivors, now adults, claim to have fragmented dreams, flashbacks, and a lifelong fear of metal corridors, red warning lights, or white coats. But none have full memories. That, according to the myth, was by design. Screen memories and false childhoods. One of the most disturbing ideas in Montauk lore is the concept of screen memories. This term, borrowed from trauma psychology and recovered memory theory, describes false recollections that overlay traumatic events with harmless imagery. For example, a child who was restrained in a lab may remember going to the dentist. Repeated injections might become a doctor visit. A long, underground hallway could be recalled as a school basement. These memories aren't lies. They are constructs, mental replacements designed to protect the conscious mind or to hide operations from later recall. According to Nichols, Camp Hero used screen memory programming deliberately. Children were exposed to trauma, then given powerful hypnotic suggestions or electromagnetic conditioning to overwrite the experience. When they left the base, they had no idea where they had been, but traces remained, an irrational fear of tunnels, recurring dreams of non-existent siblings, a lifelong suspicion that something happened, but they can't say what. To some, these are just signs of ordinary psychological struggle. To others, they are echoes of stolen years. The super-gifted initiative. Among the lesser-known claims embedded in the Montauk narrative is mention of a sub-project referred to as the super-gifted program. According to Nichols, this initiative was designed not just to identify psychically sensitive children, but to cultivate them, to mold them into fully functional operatives with highly specific mental capabilities. The goal wasn't just raw psychic power, but control, focus, and predictability. The perfect mind weapon. To achieve this, Montauk researchers allegedly designed a curriculum that mixed sensory isolation, total darkness, silence, or repeated stimulus to dull natural perception, emotional dissociation, encouraging the child to detach from fear, pain, or empathy, symbolic processing, using archetypes, colors, and patterns to encode mental instructions, stress-based induction, purposefully creating fear or distress to activate latent abilities. Some accounts describe children being forced to mentally create images under stress. A red door that, if visualized correctly, would end pain. A maze, and their task was to guide a figure through it in real time using only thought. A blank screen where they were told to see the future. The more successful children allegedly entered trance states on command or displayed unusual abilities, like telepathic communication with other subjects. Many, Nichols claimed, broke. Some shut down emotionally. Others dissociated so completely they no longer responded to their names. These were considered acceptable losses. Duncan, the teacher. In later stages of the Montauk Project, Nichols wrote that Duncan Cameron was no longer just a test subject, he became a trainer. His psychic resonance was said to be so refined that he could sync with a child through the Montauk chair and lead them through mental exercises without ever speaking. He was described as a kind of guide in the inner space, creating mental constructs that other children could enter. Some believed that Duncan could implant symbolic lessons, imagery that taught control, obedience, or focus. But there was a risk. Duncan, by this point, had already experienced timeline collapses, memory splits, and deep trance trauma. According to Nichols, his own sense of self was deteriorating, and at times, children exposed to him would mirror his fractured state, experiencing confusion, fear, or even possession-like symptoms. In one incident, a child reportedly began speaking in Duncan's voice during an isolation session. After that, Duncan was removed from training duties. Or so the story goes. Are they out there now? Perhaps the most haunting implication of the Montauk child experiment narrative is this. What if some of these children were released into society with no memory of what they experienced, but with abilities still latent inside them? Nichols and others suggested that some graduates of the Montauk program were placed in normal homes under cover identities, sometimes as adopted children, sometimes through fake birth records. Their memories suppressed, their training buried. But over time, triggers could reactivate what was hidden. A specific sound frequency, a particular phrase, a symbol they'd seen as a child. When triggered, these individuals might enter trance states without understanding why, receive visions or mental commands, act under post-hypnotic suggestion left dormant for decades. Some believers think these people are among us today, unaware, ordinary on the outside until something awakens. Nichols never named names. He only said, you wouldn't know them until they were activated, when the memories leak. Not all alleged Montauk survivors remain silent. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, scattered individuals, mostly men in their late 30s and 40s, began publishing anonymous testimonials online. Their stories were fragmented, often confusing, but carried recurring motifs. Vivid dreams of military hallways, a deep fear of static electricity or fluorescent lights, a lifelong feeling that something important was missing from their childhood. They weren't conspiracy theorists. Some had careers in law, medicine, or education, but all described a moment, a sound, a face, a location that unlocked something. In many accounts, that moment was visiting Montauk itself. Standing near the radar tower, walking through the broken bunkers, they described a sensation not of déjà vu, but of recognition. I've been here before. I know what's underground, even though I've never seen it. I knew what would be behind that door, and I was right. These were not claims of time travel. They were experiences of memory bleed moments when the screen memories failed to fully mask the past. The return of the lost boys. Montauk's lost children became a myth within a myth. In forums and fringe books, they were called the Orphans of Hero, the Silent Batch, the Zero Class, the Remote Sons. Each name evoked the same image: children used and discarded by a system too secret to exist. Children who may now live ordinary lives, unaware that their thoughts, fears, or gifts were shaped in underground rooms. Authors began weaving them into fiction, blending fact and legend. A man haunted by dreams of wires in his skull. A woman who could hear distant radio signals without a receiver. A child who drew a blueprint of a room no one had shown him, and years later discovered it was a decommissioned Montauk lab. Even though there is no proof, the idea endures, because it explains too much, because it comforts those who feel broken, because it feels true even if it isn't verifiably real. Cultural aftershocks. The myth of the Montauk children seeped into television, games, comics, and books. Not just in Stranger Things, but in stories that carried the same DNA. Government labs and vanished kids. Psychic training and hidden memories. A lonely radar tower that hums even when turned off. What began as fringe theory became cultural language, a way to speak about trauma, alienation, and distrust of power without naming it outright. Montauk became symbol, mirror, and confession all at once. And for those who believe, the children are not fiction. They are out there, watching, forgetting, remembering. Chapter 5, The Montauk Machine. One of the most persistent and peculiar aspects of the Montauk legend is the machinery. Not the metaphorical kind, not the machinery of secrecy or psychological control, but literal machines. Wires, consoles, chairs, coils, chambers, and devices allegedly constructed to bend the laws of physics. Those who dismiss the Montauk Project as fiction often focus on the more fantastic claims: monsters, time travel, alien beings. But believers argue that the story's technical consistency, bizarre as it is, deserves more attention. Because the Montauk myth doesn't just say something weird happened. It says, this is how it worked. Tesla and the theoretical blueprint. Many Montauk researchers point to one name at the foundation of its technology: Nikola Tesla. According to Nichols, the core systems of the Montauk chair and its associated field generators were derived from lost or suppressed Tesla patents, documents that never made it into public record, either seized by the U.S. government after his death or simply erased. Tesla's real work in the early 20th century dealt with wireless energy transfer, resonant frequency, electromagnetic induction, rotating magnetic fields. These are all genuine technologies, decades ahead of their time. Tesla envisioned towers that could project power across the globe without wires, machines that could tune into the vibrational signature of any object, and systems that could influence human physiology through oscillating electromagnetic waves. Montauk believers argue that some of his work formed the basis of field modulation experiments. In particular, scalar wave manipulation, theoretical waveforms that can penetrate solid matter, zero-point energy extraction, Pulsed EM fields for consciousness alteration. In the Montauk mythos, Tesla's research wasn't just innovative, it was dangerous. Not because of what it might destroy, but because of what it might unlock. The Montauk chair, hardware for the mind. The centerpiece of Camp Hero's alleged psychic technology was the Montauk chair, a large, padded metal seat wired to computers, wave generators, and signal amplifiers. It looked, according to some accounts, like a cross between a dentist's chair and an electric throne. But it wasn't the chair itself that mattered, it was the field around it. Nichols claimed that when a subject, typically Duncan Cameron, sat in the chair, a rotating series of frequency generators would emit custom wave patterns tuned to the subject's brainwaves. These would synchronize with the theta state, 4 to 7 Hz, the brain's dream or subconscious frequency. Feed back the brainwave signal in a loop, amplifying intention. Encode that signal into electromagnetic pulses that could affect remote environments. In effect, the system acted as a mind-to-field converter. The more focused the subject's thoughts, the more stable the output became. Early experiments reportedly caused nausea, headaches, even hallucinations in nearby rooms, as if Duncan's thoughts were bleeding into the physical space. Later versions allegedly opened rifts in space-time. Skeptics point out that no physical version of such a chair has ever been found. Believers counter. If it worked, it was never meant to be found. Time tunnels and zero-time reference. Perhaps the most technical and baffling element of the Montauk lore is the claim that time travel was achieved not by moving objects through space, but by shifting their temporal anchor. The process involved something called a zero-time reference, a hypothetical point outside of all conventional time, against which all movement and change could be measured. In Montauk theory, everything in our universe is synchronized to the clock of this reference point. But if you could disconnect an object from that anchor and attach it to a different temporal frame, one from the past or future, you could effectively move it in time. How? According to Nichols, a subject in the chair generated a stable thought form, a location in time. Field generators created a vortex linked to that temporal target. The subject's consciousness, or physical body, was guided through the opening. The result was either full transference, teleportation, or a psychic connection across time. He claimed that at one point, they opened a tunnel large enough to send physical objects through, and even constructed temporary stations in other time periods for observation. The science fiction, but it's internally consistent, and that consistency is part of what makes the myth so compelling. Science and speculation, where it breaks and where it doesn't. Skeptics often dismiss the Montauk story as pure fantasy, and much of it, time travel, consciousness projection, zero-time reference points, does defy conventional science. But what's striking isn't just what breaks physics, it's what nearly fits. Let's examine a few key concepts from the Montauk narrative and compare them to real-world science. 1. Brainwave synchronization and feedback loops. Brain claim. The Montauk chair could detect a subject's brainwaves, then amplify and rebroadcast them into electromagnetic fields to influence reality. White heavy checkmark reality, e.g., electroencephalogram, devices have been used for decades to measure brain activity. Neurofeedback, where brainwaves are displayed back to a subject in real time, is a recognized psychological treatment for ADHD, PTSD, and anxiety. These systems use live brainwave data to train people to self-regulate their mental states. Warning: Montauk exaggeration. There is no evidence that this signal can be projected beyond the body to affect the external world, let alone space-time. 2. Pulsed electromagnetic fields, PEMF, and consciousness alteration. High voltage claim. Camp Hero used pulsed EM fields to suppress memory, induce trance states, and control thought. White heavy checkmark reality. Pulsed electromagnetic fields are used in real medicine. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, is an FDA-approved method for treating depression, targeting specific areas of the brain using magnetic pulses. Warning: Montauk exaggeration. While TMS can affect mood and cognition, the idea of fully controlling thoughts or planting ideas remotely is unsupported, but not entirely beyond the realm of theoretical neuroscience. 3. Zero-point energy and scalar waves. Microscope claim. The Montauk chair operated on zero-point energy and emitted scalar waves to open dimensional rifts. Crossmark reality. Zero-point energy does exist. It's the lowest possible energy state in quantum physics. But we have no way to extract it meaningfully, and no verified method for using it to power devices. Scalar waves, meanwhile, are not recognized by mainstream physics. They are hypothetical and heavily disputed. This part of the Montauk story crosses from speculation into pseudoscience, though it borrows the language of real physics to sound plausible. 4. Time dilation and relativity. Hourglass not done claim. Montauk experiments used frequency fields to move objects through time. White heavy checkmark reality. Einstein's theory of relativity does predict time dilation. Time moves slower for objects traveling at high speeds or near intense gravity, as seen in satellites and black holes. But this effect is tiny in practical terms and does not allow for backward time travel. Warning: Montauk leap. The story takes a known effect, time behaving differently under certain conditions, and extends it into full time travel, which current physics does not support. A story wrapped in technical language. One of the cleverest features of the Montauk mythos is its use of technical jargon. Terms like delta wave entrainment, quantum phase lock, subspace harmonics, biosignal coherence sound credible, especially to non-scientists, but many of them are either misused, speculative, or invented entirely. This technique creates a veneer of plausibility, not enough to convince physicists, but enough to anchor the imagination. And for a sleep story, that's what matters. If the machines were real, let's entertain the idea for just a moment that the devices described at Montauk actually existed. What would that mean? It would mean someone somewhere had unlocked a completely new kind of physics, one capable of turning thought into form, collapsing space, or detaching consciousness from time. It would mean the human brain had become not just a receiver of reality, but a generator. And most chillingly, it would mean that the true weapons of war might not be missiles or code, but people themselves. But if such machines existed, where are they now? This is where the Montauk story takes its most intriguing turn, not in what it claims to reveal, but in how it justifies absence. According to Nichols and those who followed him, the technology was dismantled after the project ended in 1983, buried in sealed underground levels of Camp Hero, or relocated to other black sites around the world. Some versions suggest the entire program was moved off-planet, to bases on the Moon or Mars, tying into larger mythologies like the secret space program. Others claim that it still operates, just under a different name, hidden by bureaucratic layers so deep no paper trail could ever surface. But perhaps the most fascinating theory is psychological. The cover story is the story. In one version of the Montauk myth, the entire science fiction layer, time portals, monsters, alien contact, is not the truth. It's the distraction, a constructed cover story, implanted in the minds of real test subjects to obscure something else. Covert psychological reprogramming, weaponized behavioral conditioning, early neural interface experiments. If those involved in the real experiments were exposed to false memories involving wild science fiction elements, they would discredit themselves if they ever spoke publicly, never be able to separate implanted experience from actual trauma, be dismissed by officials, friends, and even therapists. In this theory, the Montauk Project is true in structure but false in detail. The people were real. The facility was real. The experiments happened, but the time portals, the monsters, maybe those were the most effective mind control devices of all. What technology leaves behind. Regardless of what one believes, the Montauk machine, real or imagined, has left a cultural imprint. It shaped the visual language of secret labs, psychic tech, and fringe science in fiction. It offered metaphors for how ideas spread, how belief shapes perception, and how memory can be manipulated, not just by governments, but by our own minds. More than anything, it showed how deeply we fear unseen control, and how desperately we want to understand the forces that might shape us without our consent. Whether through radio towers, digital screens, or quiet thoughts projected in the dark. Chapter 6. The Spiral and the Signal. Long after the supposed experiments at Camp Hero ended, after the chairs were dismantled, the tunnels sealed, and the personnel scattered, the Montauk Project refused to die. Not as a classified operation or even a real place, but as a signal. A frequency still resonating through pop culture, internet myth, and underground storytelling. Not because it was proven, but because it was felt. In fiction, music, memes, and whispered threads, the Montauk Project has become something more than a conspiracy theory. It has become a mythos, from underground to algorithm. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Montauk lived in Xerox booklets, fringe radio shows, and obscure interviews. But the internet, particularly forums, blogs, and YouTube, transformed it from rumor into narrative ecosystem. Video essays, found footage, ARGs, alternate reality games, creepypasta, podcasts, Reddit threads with thousands of comments, TikToks of users visiting the Montauk radar and swearing their phones stopped working for no reason. Montauk has been absorbed into the language of digital storytelling, where fact and fiction aren't always meant to be separate. It's no longer just, did this happen? But what if it could? How would we know if it did? Isn't that exactly what they'd want us to think? It lives at the edge of truth, where the mind relaxes its grip and starts to wonder. Stranger Things and the Spiral Effect. When Stranger Things debuted in 2016, it didn't just borrow from Montauk. It amplified it. The show was originally titled Montauk in early scripts. The creators, the Duffer Brothers, cited the project directly as a key influence, a secret lab, a psychic child trained by government agents, a breach between dimensions, a small town haunted by things it can't see. The resonance was immediate. A new generation, many of whom had never heard of Camp Hero, were introduced to the emotional core of the Montauk legend. Children used, memories lost, realities bent, truth hidden in plain sight. And while Stranger Things became a mainstream hit, the ripple effect reached into lesser-known media. Indie comics exploring parallel timelines, music videos referencing The Chair, podcasts blending fiction and documentary-style exposition, games and VR experiences set in facilities suspiciously like Montauk. This is the spiral effect. A story feeds culture, culture feeds story, and round it goes. Symbols that spread. Certain images from the Montauk myth have become cultural icons, even outside their origin. Cyclone, the radar tower, a symbol of unseen surveillance and government secrecy. The Chair, the idea that thought can become a weapon or a window. Black square button hallways with endless fluorescent lights, institutional control, memory suppression. Bust in silhouette children without histories, the anxiety of being forgotten or misused. You can now find references in album art, fan tattoos, street murals, online dream journals, horror ARGs, and liminal space aesthetics. Even those who've never heard the word Montauk may have felt it in a show, a visual, a sense of unease in a room that's just too quiet. Why these legends survive. At their core, Stories like Montauk aren't just about shadowy science or government experiments. They're about something much more universal. Who am I really? What parts of my life might be hidden, even from myself? What if my memories aren't the full truth? These questions resonate deeply in a world where surveillance is constant but invisible. Our data knows more about us than we do. Memories can be rewritten by repetition, media, and trauma. Childhoods are increasingly mediated by technology and separation. Montauk becomes a metaphor for lost identity, institutional betrayal, and the fear that our past is not entirely our own. It's not about whether the machine existed. It's about how easy it is to believe that it could. Myth in the age of misinformation. We live in what many call the post-truth era, where facts are blurred, narratives weaponized, and belief often trumps evidence. Montauk fits this landscape perfectly. It doesn't beg for proof. It thrives in uncertainty, tells a story that feels plausible, emotionally real, even when it's logically absurd. I don't remember much from that time. There's a part of my life that doesn't add up. I've always felt like something happened, but I can't explain it, and it offers a mythological resolution to that unease. We used to look for meaning in gods, signs, or dreams. Now we find it in conspiracies, patterns, and digital archetypes. Montauk is no longer a place. It's an idea that someone else might be holding the remote control to your life. Echoes in the archive. Even now, YouTubers still upload 3-hour breakdowns of the Montauk Project. Reddit threads speculate about connections to Antarctica, CERN, or Pine Gap. Fiction podcasts turn the base into the epicenter of psychic cataclysms. Urban explorers wander the Camp Hero ruins with GoPros, hoping to find something, anything, behind a rusted door. And in comments, people still write, "My uncle worked there. He won't talk about it. I used to have dreams of a hallway just like that. I thought I was the only one who remembered." It continues because it answers questions no one else will answer, because it fills silence with story, because it makes uncertainty sacred. Chapter 7. The End That Never Was. Every legend needs a climax. For the Montauk Project, it came on August 12, 1983. The day the machines were powered down, the tunnels were supposedly sealed, and the story itself fractured into myth. Some say this was the moment the entire operation spiraled out of control. Others believe it was planned all along, the final act of a carefully managed delusion. But nearly every version of the Montauk narrative points to a singular collapse, not just of machinery, but of reality itself. The date that echoed through time. August 12, 1983 is not a random date in the lore. It is said to be a temporal resonance point, a key node in the space-time fabric. Why? Because, according to Nichols and others, it was exactly 40 years after the Philadelphia experiment of August 12, 1943. That earlier experiment, shrouded in its own fog of conspiracy, allegedly involved cloaking the USS Eldridge using electromagnetic fields, and resulted in bizarre side effects. Crew members fused into the hull, disappearances and reappearances, loss of time and memory, jumping across dimensions. Montauk believers claim the two dates were linked by a kind of temporal tether, a frequency resonance that aligned the events of 1943 and 1983, allowing for a psychic bridge or even a time loop. This, they say, caused chaos in the Montauk base. Something broke through. Something they couldn't control. The shutdown. Preston Nichols recounted that the psychic subject in the Montauk chair, Duncan Cameron, was pushed to his mental limit during the August 12th experiment. He was allegedly instructed to manifest something uncontrolled as a test of the system's range. What came through was undefined. Some versions say, a beast, a psychic projection made flesh, now known as the Montauk Monster, a temporal rupture. Space folding in on itself, tunnels warping, rooms disappearing. A thought form out of control, the raw, amplified unconsciousness of a tortured human mind. Whatever it was, it could not be contained. Nichols and others allegedly took matters into their own hands, sabotaging the systems, cutting power to the transmitters, and intentionally destroying the project to stop the breach. The base, they say, was locked down and the deeper levels filled in with concrete. And Duncan? He simply vanished, or was reset, or lives on unaware. Was there ever a base beneath the base? Visitors to Camp Hero today can walk among the ruins. The radar tower still looms. The buildings remain weathered but intact. But the supposed underground complex, with miles of tunnels and chambers, remains missing, sealed, if it ever existed. Attempts to explore below the surface are blocked by welded hatches, locked doors marked U.S. government property, local officials who claim it's unsafe and contains asbestos, a complete lack of official records on what lies beneath. For believers, this is confirmation. For skeptics, it's a convenient excuse. But everyone agrees. Something is down there. The radar tower still hums at night. Phones lose signal near certain walls. Dogs refuse to enter some buildings. And there are no blueprints, not even declassified ones. What came after? The shutdown of the Montauk Project didn't mean the end of the story. In fact, that's when it really began, not as an operation, but as a living folklore system constantly evolving. But for those allegedly involved, the end was more personal and more dangerous. Disappearing witnesses. Over the years, various individuals stepped forward claiming to have worked at Montauk. Not just Preston Nichols and Duncan Cameron, but others using aliases or partial identities. Engineers who said they built field dampeners, but didn't know what they were used for. Security guards who recalled being drugged or reset after shifts. A nurse who allegedly assisted with traumatized children, then had a mental breakdown. Some gave interviews, then vanished. Others retracted their statements, citing pressure or threats. A few died under mysterious or sudden circumstances. Of course, in the world of conspiracy lore, this only feeds the fire. Disappearance isn't absence, it's evidence. The silence of the system. Official records from Montauk Air Force Station are sparse. The radar tower, known as the /FPS-35, was indeed experimental, and the base was used for classified research during the Cold War. But nothing links it to psychic studies, time travel, or interdimensional technology. The official narrative is one of routine closure and environmental risk, standard for decommissioned military sites. Yet to this day, parts of the base remain off-limits to the public. No tours, no maps, no cameras allowed in certain sections. When journalists have tried to dig deeper, they've often found nothing, not even confirmation that anything of interest ever occurred. And that, too, becomes part of the story. We turned it off, but not forever. In later interviews, Nichols made cryptic remarks that suggested the Montauk Project wasn't truly destroyed, just dormant. That the chair was rebuilt elsewhere. That the personnel were reassigned. That what began at Camp Hero continues today in private sector labs, on offshore platforms, or in countries without oversight. And that one day, when the frequencies align again, it could be reactivated. Not to test, but to control. The end that never ends. If the Montauk Project was real, it failed because it worked. If it was fake, it succeeded because it felt true. If it was something in between, it's still unfolding in minds, memories, and myths. That is the genius or the terror of stories like Montauk. They don't require belief. They only require imagination. And in a world where imagination has become data and memory has become code, perhaps the Montauk Project is more real now than it ever was then. All it needs is someone to flip the switch again. Chapter 8, Echoes in the Mind. Even if the Montauk Project never existed in physical form, with wires, corridors, and devices, it undoubtedly exists in minds, in dreams, in memory fragments, in unexplained fears and vivid déjà vu. For some, Montauk is not a story they read. It's a feeling they've always carried, long before they had a name for it. This chapter explores that fragile border between memory and myth and asks a difficult question. If someone remembers something that never happened, does that memory still matter? Recovered memories or implanted ones? In the 1980s and 1990s, the Western world witnessed a psychological wave known as the recovered memory movement. Thousands of adults, often in therapy, began recalling childhood abuse, participation in secret rituals, unseen observers watching them as children. In some cases, these memories were validated. In others, they were proven to be false, products of suggestion, leading questions, or even media exposure. Montauk sits at the crossroads of that phenomenon. Its survivors rarely remember their involvement all at once. Instead, their memories arrive in fragments, a hallway that never existed, an unnatural fear of static or blinking lights, dreams of being restrained, observed, or tested. Are these suppressed memories, or are they absorbed cultural symbols, retroactively woven into a personal narrative by stories, forums, or fear? Modern psychology warns us the mind can fabricate vivid false memories, especially when stress, trauma, and isolation are involved. But here's the ethical dilemma. Does calling them false make them any less painful, or real in their emotional impact? The trauma of uncertainty, whether real or imagined. Many people who associate with Montauk lore report similar symptoms: anxiety, flashbacks, chronic dissociation, a deep mistrust of authority and institutions, difficulty distinguishing dreams from lived experiences. Some seek therapy. Others retreat further into online communities where they find not just acceptance but shared belief. They're not alone. They're not crazy. They're part of something. This brings comfort, but also risk, because what if the belief deepens the trauma instead of healing it? What if the story that soothes you is the same one that's harming you? Screen memories and psychic scars. In Montauk lore, there's the concept of screen memories, fake recollections implanted to mask a traumatic real one. A child remembers visiting a strange dentist, but not the lab underneath. A man recalls a dream about drowning, but not the tank he was tested in. A woman fears hospitals, but never had a reason why. Psychologists recognize the screen memory phenomenon too, especially in survivors of severe trauma. The mind builds protective distortions, a kind of narrative bubble, to protect itself. In Montauk's case, the screen may not be individual at all. It may be cultural, a collective fog placed over something society doesn't want to face. The ethics of belief. So what should we do with stories like Montauk? Dismiss them? Debunk them? Indulge them? There is no simple answer. Some scholars suggest we treat them as folk trauma, stories that express real fears, real damage, and real emotion, even if the literal events are unverifiable or false. Others warn that indulging these myths can lead to delusional belief systems, cult behavior, the rewriting of real history. But there is a middle path, one of compassionate skepticism, acknowledging the emotional truth, respecting the storyteller, and gently challenging the narrative where needed to protect others from harm. In this way, Montauk is less about science or hoax and more about the question, what do people need to believe in order to feel whole again? Chapter 9, Dreams in the Radar. The Montauk Project is often told in late-night YouTube videos, soft-voice podcasts, or whispered audio diaries meant to be listened to while falling asleep. But why? Why would a tale of time warps, memory erasure, and psychic trauma become a sleep story, the very thing meant to ease us into rest. It's not a contradiction. It's the point. Montauk is not about terror. It's about thresholds between sleep and wakefulness, between memory and invention, between real and unreal. In that way, it is perfectly suited to be absorbed in the half-lit mental space where dreams begin, the hypnagogic zone. Sleep scientists refer to the early stage of sleep, that drifting moment when thoughts blur and time softens, as the hypnagogic state. This is when you might hear voices that aren't there. You see vivid mental images not tied to reality. You feel like you're falling or floating or moving through impossible places. Sound familiar? The imagery of Montauk, the endless hallways, strange machines, soft radio signals, and memories that don't belong to you, fits perfectly into this dreamlike terrain. It's not a horror story. It's a liminal story, a story that feels like it was meant not to scare, but to dissolve. Soft voices and strange places. Montauk sleep narrators often speak slowly, gently, with extended pauses. Their voices carry not urgency, but detachment, like someone recalling something just out of reach. The effect is hypnotic. You're drawn into a lab with humming machines, a boy sitting silently in a chair, eyes closed, a door that was there yesterday but not today, the sound of water pipes that you didn't hear until now. It's not about plot, it's about tone, a drone of unease, stretched until it becomes comfort. This makes Montauk ideal for ASMR-style storytelling, sleep-inducing audio documentaries, night-themed horror channels that focus more on atmosphere than shock. You're not supposed to remember every detail. You're supposed to fade into it. Fear that feels safe. There's a strange comfort in softly told stories of unsettling things. It's the same reason we fall asleep to rain on haunted roofs, distant train whistles, low, crackling radios from another time. These sounds signal that something is happening, but it's far away. It's not coming for you. It already happened. Montauk, when told as a sleep story, becomes a ghost of a ghost. A story without a climax. A danger that already passed. A threat that never quite touches you. And that's why people sleep to it. Because it makes your own life, your own bedroom, your own thoughts feel more normal by comparison. The radar that watches over you. At the end of so many Montauk stories, the radar tower remains. Always spinning, always humming, never entirely explained. In the dream version of Montauk, the radar becomes a guardian, not a threat. Keeps the strange world contained. It holds the memories in place. It signals that the chaos is locked away and morning is coming. It is, in a strange way, a lullaby. Chapter 10. The Project That Dreamed Itself. What if the Montauk Project was never a secret experiment, but something stranger? What if it was a dream dreamed not by one person, but by many across decades, cultures, and technologies? Not a lie, not the truth, but a kind of mirror, reflecting back our fears, hopes, and unanswered questions. Because maybe the Montauk Project isn't a place you find on a map. Maybe it's a place you find inside your own memory, even if you've never been there. A mirror for the modern mind. Look closely and you'll see it. Montauk reflects everything we don't understand about ourselves. Why we forget entire years. Why we sometimes feel watched. Why we can't trust the stories we tell ourselves or the silence we live with. In an age of government overreach, digital surveillance, deepfakes, and lost time online, Montauk becomes a story about disconnection from reality. It says, maybe there's a reason you don't remember your past clearly. Maybe the holes in your story aren't your fault. Maybe the truth was taken from you. It's a powerful message, one that brings comfort and danger a story that writes itself. The Montauk Project keeps expanding, not because it needs new facts, but because it invites reinterpretation. In that way, it functions like a dream. You remember a hallway, and someone else says, "I've been there too." You read about a chair that reads thoughts, and you think, "I've felt that before." You hear a name, Duncan or Preston, and feel like you've heard it before. Not in a past life, not in a file, but somewhere in the fabric of imagination. Montauk is recursive. It's self-generating. It writes you into itself just by thinking about it. The project never ended. If Montauk really was a psychic experiment, one that sought to implant ideas, rewrite minds, and project dreams into reality, then maybe it succeeded, not by building the machine, but by making you believe it might have existed. That's the final twist. Montauk didn't happen, then become a story. Montauk was the story, and that made it happen. Where does it leave you? Now, as the story winds down, consider, what do you remember that no one else does? Have you ever had a dream so vivid you questioned whether it was a memory? Do you sometimes feel like something's missing? Not in your life, but in your past? Montauk doesn't give you answers. It gives you the questions. The rest is up to you, because maybe the most dangerous thing the Montauk Project ever did was make us believe it could be true. And if this story stirred something in you, if it made you wonder about the things we forget, or the things we're made to forget, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel for more quiet journeys into the strange, the hidden, and the half-remembered. Stories from the edge of history and the edge of sleep. Leave a comment if something felt familiar. Like the video if you want more like this, and share it with someone who dreams with their eyes open. Thanks for being here. Until next time, sleep well.